Okay, so you're going to, for the first project in this class, design a series of book covers. The objective of this assignment is to create visual consistency over a series, which is basically designing in a system, and you're going to design a total of 3 books. So you're going to create visual consistency, but also create variety to make them distinguish from each other. So one thing to consider is what it means to design within a system. So just like when you're using Adobe InDesign file and you're having a grid layout and you're using that consistently, that is a type of a system. But sometimes you're not just dealing with one type of document. You're actually designing across multiple platforms or designing all sorts of different materials. And so these are things that you are familiar with already from just looking at samples of a branding system, for example. You see the example on the bottom left in which they're using consistent use of their typeface and logo. That is a system that they've created. So they have buttons, they have business cards, brochures, etc. So there's a common aesthetic, which means that they have common assets, common colors, common fonts, graphics, patterns, but it also doesn't mean that you are restricted to using things exactly the same way every time. You want to create a little bit more freedom as well. So you see on the bottom right is that these look visually consistent with each other in the sense that there's like some commonalities, there's definitely an aesthetic, but there's some variety amongst it quite a bit as well. So this is how you create unification by using the common aesthetic, but then you're creating that variety to prevent any static or stagnant designs by changing things up slightly of placement and things like that. So that's something to really consider when you're designing within a system. So for a book cover series, it's a really great opportunity to expand your application of illustration. So those of you who are unfamiliar or uncomfortable with how to illustrate, this is going to be a challenge for you, and that's on purpose. So you have more time to just really focus on this book cover image, because remember, we do judge a book by its cover. You need to capture the attention of a customer, a reader, a viewer, to say, hey, pick up my book, read a little bit more, see if you want to buy me. That is a lot of bang for your buck, a lot of pressure on one little space. So this is an example of how the author is really promoted here. So if you had like a Stephen King book series, for example, you would really make the author's name large, because that's the selling point, is the author here. If you were just dealing with authors that weren't as well known, but it's the book title is going to capture someone's attention more because it tells you more about what it's about, that's why you would create visual hierarchy for the book title. So here they kind of have an interesting aesthetic of kind of cut paper, tracing paper that's really beautiful. Consistent use of the letter forms that they've used for the author's name, but then creating variety elsewhere. Oliver Sacks is a really interesting author. So one of the book authors that you can choose for this project is Malcolm Gladwell, and he is a really interesting author as well, of the variety of things he talks about. So this is a good example of how you're trying to create a visual narrative for a book that is about so many things at so many different intellectual levels. So this is a good, interesting series as well. Here you can see how you can kind of go the Art Deco route with this beautiful illustration. The style is consistent, but the colors are the same muted tones as well. So they have variety, but they still look visually consistent. This is a more traditional route when you're dealing with someone's name like Stephen King, for example, that you want to have really consistent size over a series. And this is the type of book series that's really helpful when you're like, this is a very prolific author. We can't spend a lot of time designing a book cover for every single book that they design, because they produce so many books that they create a system that really streamlines the process, and that someone, when they look at a bookshelf, can easily recognize their favorite author and book series, so they can just pick one up and buy a new one. This is a beautiful version as well. You can see that there's consistent use of a color palette and how they use the white lines to separate visual imagery, but then they have fun with the different shapes that they're using as well. And then they've also thought about how it looks when it's all next to each other on a bookshelf when you're looking at the spine. So you really want to think about that too, is how it looks on the spines. And you'll notice that all the spines, the type is all facing the same direction. Here is a good example of how you have a consistent aesthetic, but there's a lot of variety. So you'll see that the typefaces actually vary more here on the front covers. And so they're taking homage to kind of old sign paintings in 1950s. So the aesthetic is this kind of 1950s sign painting, clip art graphics that you would see in a store window trying to get your attention that there's a sale. But so that's what's consistent, but the typefaces they use are different. So you have to be careful about when you're changing things up like a typeface, as long as other elements are consistent enough. So the flat shapes on the covers are consistent use. And when they use photographs, they use them in a consistent manner. And then you can see on the back and on the spines, they kind of have a really good system as well. This is a great example because if you'll notice that some of the samples that you're allowed to use for the book cover might be really popular series in which you already have imagery associated with a series, like Harry Potter, for example, or Hunger Games, or Jane Austen, is to figure out how would you break out of that norm of what you already have seen. How could you look at it at a different perspective and try a different design perspective as well. So that's something to really consider when you're designing, is try to create something unique. In fact, it's kind of required to create something unique to your own. You have more time to create unique illustrations. You're not dealing with a whole lot of space and a whole lot of content, so you have time to do research, learn more about these books, figure out what kind of clicks with you and what you think would grab the viewer's attention. So resources that are provided is I highlight specifically that there's a section in the Design Elements book that talks about designing with systems. So I really require that you read that section to really help understand how you can create visual consistency. And then also I've added Photoshop mockup files as part of this project to learn, if you haven't learned already, how to use smart objects and mock up how an actual project would look like in three-dimensional form. And so there's another video that actually tells you how to get started with the mock-up files and how to use them. But so those are things that are provided for you as well that you need to download. Additionally, you'll see in the project brief that there's the anatomy of the book cover. So you'll see on the back, typically you have the reviews and the blurbs on the top. So depending on the book, if you think that everybody knows what the book is and you just want to use praise to get someone's attention, you can put that. But usually you expect to be able to learn about what the book is about on the back. So that's what you call blurb. And then you have the author biography, which is easy to find, and barcode and additional materials. For example, you have to have your website for the publisher and the publisher graphic, etc. You have the spine, and then obviously the front cover, which by requirement means at least the title and the author name, and you can decide how big each one is. So you create the visual hierarchy. If you think someone's attention will be more grabbed by the author's name, then you can do that, or you can do it vice versa with the title. So that's something to consider. I think that for this project, you might have a little bit more fun creating more unique application of type for the title rather than focusing on the author name. So timeline for this project, you'll see that you are getting started, you are researching, so you need to actually figure out what these books are. And I encourage you that even if you have a favorite right away, I would encourage you to at least look into the other ones as well and look up the synopsis of the individual books. I want you to gather reference imagery. That means you can create a Pinterest board, all sorts of ways that you can gather imagery here that you are trying to reference of what kind of aesthetic you want to establish. You need to create type studies of what you want to use. The more the better. I don't want to see a type study that only has 3 typefaces on it. And then you also want to create some common color palettes. So during the exercise process, you learned how to create color palettes. So I want you to create a couple different color palettes as part of your reference as well and figure out which one you might want. And then, of course, I want you to do thumbnail sketches. So that's included in the project brief. I want to see a minimum of 12. So those thumbnail sketches will inform how things will change. So you might have a series of 3. So you have 3 sketches that kind of match within one system, and then you switch with another 3 for another system. So, 3 book covers, 3 thumbnails, minimum of 12. That means you need to explore at least 4 different ways to do things, 4 systems. Next class on Thursday, you'll see you have a work day to really hone all those things. Exercise number 2 is due in case that you have changes and things that you want to edit on that. We will have individual critiques the following day, and you're going to have the digital files created. You should have started designing. You're going to have all your research. The more you have, the better. And then again, you'll have workday, and this is because you're going to really focus on honing these illustrations. These should be very refined graphics. I should see a lot of exploration. Look how much time you have to do this. You're going to do that, and then the last week is that we're going to have the graphics printed on the laser printer. Is fine, full size, and then so we can all look at them together and finalize things before they are due. So the last thing is, you may notice on the page it says deliverables that you're like, holy smokes, she is asking for a lot of files. And this primarily is to get you to understand the difference between the files that you are creating. And then for now, I want all of the files that you've created. So you're going to, from the InDesign file or Illustrator file, depending on what you're using to create these covers, you're going to export each of those artboards or pages, those book covers, as individual files. So you'll have book cover 1, 2, and 3. And then when you have Photoshop open and you're creating those mock-ups, you're going to save those as PDFs as well. So that's the difference. It's not going to take you a huge amount of time to do that, but you just want to make sure they're actually giving me all the files I asked for. And then you'll see under printed that you need to have the portfolio, 11 by 17 portfolio for this class, as mentioned in the syllabus. So most of you already have that already from other previous classes. So you're going to print out the mock-up files for this project. So you'll see that these kind of have the pages. Page 1 has project strategy brief, expected grade explanations, and then you'll have the 2 mock-up files. And those prints from the Epson printer, which you need to have printed at the print center, are included in your class fee. So you need to make sure that you plan accordingly to have those submitted. So those are the printed documents that you need submitted, and then you have all the other digital documents at the end.